Hi, welcome to Wisdom from the Aerial View, the podcast for those who wish to crush their anxiety and find meaning and purpose in their lives. You might notice that I made the introduction this week instead of Enid, because Enid unfortunately is under the weather. So for the first time since we initiated this podcast a year and a half ago, Enid is not joining us, but we have a guest today. We have a very interesting guest, a very accomplished guest named Ed Hajim. I will introduce Ed this way. He started out as I won't tell you how he started out. I'm going to let him tell you how his early life started out, because that's a fascinating part of the story. He was a Wall Street executive, very successful financially, has been a role model and a mentor to many, many young people and people at university levels and so on. And he continues to do this at this point in his life. And he's written 2 books, which are designed to help people find their own way through their life. And I'll let Ed talk about that. His first book was called On the Road Less Traveled, An Unlikely Journey from the Orphanage to the Boardroom. We'll get to that book second, I think, but I do want Ed to spend some time on it because his story is quite fantastic. His second book, it was called The Island of the 4 Ps, and I'm going to let Ed talk quite a bit about that because it's very instructive, and I think our listeners are going to really enjoy his particular point of view and his approach. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome my friend and super interesting person, Ed Hajim. Hello, Ed.
Mark, thanks for having me. It's always great talking to you. I have to be on a podcast. I'll just call you up and chat with you because you're always interested and you're stimulating, and the stuff that you do is the kind of thing that I love to read. I don't know really where to start. I can start you at the end of the story, which is now. I basically am on a presumptuous crusade to add a dimension to university education. I can sort of try to absorb what I just said. I'm going to change academia. You can't do that because I was chairman of the board of trustees for 8 years at the University of Rochester, so I know the problems. But I basically believe that education has 2 parts to it, or there are 2 kinds of education. One is an education teaches you how to make a living, and a second education teaches you how to make a life. And that used to be education and parental involvement and all that kind of stuff. But what's happened basically is universities do a reasonable good job of teaching kids how to make a living, or at least approach to making a living. But they don't do a great job, at least formally, in teaching them how to make a life. That's usually done in the dormitories, the dining rooms. It's done informally, so it's kind of messy. What I want to do is to do that formally. So from my book called The Island of the 4 Ps, I've developed a vocabulary for your inner voice for making decisions. Find your passions, find your principles, find your partners, find your plans. There may be other words, but these have been basically good for me. It's what I use to make decisions through my life, and I'll talk about my life and how successful or how it progressed through my entire life. And also, I wanted them to recognize there are 4 realms of life: self, family, work, and community. Community by work, giving back. And these 8 words, I think I've taken now and created a course for freshmen or seniors in high school, where 8 sessions starts off with each of the young students telling their stories to each other, and then going from there, focusing on those 8 words. And, it's like anything else in the world. You go out with the dog food to see where the dog's going to eat it, and you offer it out. And it looks to me like there's enormous latent demand. I've been at this for a couple of years. I've not been turned down in any place at all. We have 10 institutions working on it now. A very excellent school in Greenwich, Connecticut. It's a very high end. Brunswick is now using it as a required course for its seniors. At the other end, in NJPAC in Newark, which is mostly first gen kids, they're using it in their high school 14 to 18 group. I have 8 universities, and Horatio Alger is using it for its scholarship. So I'm kind of excited about it, and I think I may have a breakthrough because Stony Brook has just started to use it. And of course, the SUNY system is like 34 schools. And I've talked I had a presentation to the career counselors there, and it may work. Now, it's not my course. I have set up a syllabus and a curriculum, a skeleton, because each of these institutions must take that skeleton or that curriculum or that syllabus and add to it or change it to fit the unique needs of their particular student body. And I think that's starting to happen now. The work done at one particular university now, University of Rochester, which started with it, they have 200 kids in 10 sections. And they basically now have innovated them into where each kid in his freshman year or whenever he takes the course has to basically create 3 life scenarios, 3 roadmaps for life. And it really is an important thing because if you start with that way, you can decide what you're going to test. And actually, I can use my own life for that expect. When I was a freshman, I signed up as a chemical engineer because I had to get a job. And so they got jobs. But in the middle of my freshman year, I decided to be a physicist because that sounded good. So I took an advanced physics course my sophomore year. All the engineers took engineering physics, which was a little easier. Within about, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, I looked around and said, these aren't my people. And by this way, they're also getting my brains beat out. So I knew that I was out of my league. I got my D plus and I left. So, but I had able to test that. Now, I didn't formally go through who I wanted to be. So in other words, what I want a freshman to ask is, who am I? Where do I want to go? How do I expect to get there? How does the road look? And if they actually have time for it, which is the 5th P purpose, they can ask, if I'm going to get there, am I going to be happy about that? And with life being changing as much as it has, that's a very difficult experience. Now, I believe opportunity is greater than it's ever been, but also complexity is about as great as it's ever been. So you need more time to formally figure out which path you're going to take. And I think what's the problem with most monikers, engineer or physicist or whatever it is, it's such a broad continuum. You got to go out and test it. And I think in the 4 years of college and graduate school, be able to test various things. And I look back through my life, I did a brilliant job of testing, and I finally got to the right answer at age, 26, 28 when I was at graduate school. But I tested a lot, though. I tested in my junior year. I went up and I worked on the St. Lawrence Seaway because I got fascinated with big projects, dams and electrical plants and so forth. And I got up there and I loved it. I talked the guy into giving me a job. I spent 6 weeks up there, and I loved the work. I mean, blasting in the afternoon at 4 o'clock or throwing cement at 200 feet was great. But then I realized you had to live in a trailer for 10 years. And the guys that I talked to said, this is the best location ever. We're usually in the hills of Pakistan or the jungles of Venezuela. So that was not a good idea. And of course, I spent both my summers at the Harvard Business School working on being an international businessman. I went to Belgium. I learned French, worked for Belgian Chemical Company. I realized that was much too early to be in international business. Then I decided, I want to take over a company, take over a country. So I went down to Nicaragua and we set up L'École de Negocios, Escuela de Negocios, a business school down there. And I would spend a whole 4 or 5 months down there, realized that was not a good idea. So I tested out. That's what I want young people to do. Find out who you are. And, what I convince young people is I give them a very simple story. I said, when you're 16 to 18 years old, you basically are a combination of your genes and your environment. You have no control whoever you are. But like my man in the book lands on an island at 18 or thereabouts, for the first time in his life or her life, you get a chance to say, this is the part of me I want to keep. This is the part of me I really like to eliminate or at least reduce. And these are the parts of me I want to add, and maybe I need to add. I'll stop there. Yeah. I can go into a little of my background if you want. But
no, we'll get to all that. So you mentioned, so there's so much. First of all, I'm thinking. So for those listeners, just let me tell you that when Ed wrote his first book, I did interview him before for a bookstore chain in Chicago, and we had a great time. I actually rewatched that interview, Ed. I really enjoyed it.
It was fun, yeah.
And then we've kept in touch, but I'm realizing now that I made a big mistake. That I should call you more often, and I'll tell you why. Because what you're talking about, you created a curriculum primarily for college students to help them learn about life. Because you're right, nobody teaches you about life. When we were growing up, well, actually, not you, because you have a different situation. I want to get to that. But for many of us of my generation, we had parents and neighbors who helped grow us up, literally, right? Who trained us. So where I grew up, if an adult in your neighborhood told you to do something, it was equivalent to a parent telling you to do something.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that now? So we had the village and we had our parents, and we learned what we consider to be fundamental rules of how to treat people, how to live, and so on. And what's happened now, unfortunately, in so many places all over the world, and a lot in the United States, kids grow up without parents, without a parent, in communities that are anything but supportive, and so they don't learn the fundamental things. The first book I wrote, which is now over 20 years ago, was called which is a self-help book. And the title was What Do I Do Now? A Handbook for Life. Oh. Because I realized that at that time, I was running a medical office. I had 60 employees. And I realized many of them were young people who did not have the benefit of the education, not the detailed education, not the curriculum education, but the life education that I had about how to live, how to treat people, what's important in life, respect, honoring your elders, all these kind of things that seem so simple to us, but are often not taught. So I applaud you. I absolutely applaud you for doing this, for spending so much time and effort to create a curriculum. And I'm thinking the reason I wish I had talked to you more often, we hopefully will be able to do this after this podcast, is because I've often just wanted to create a curriculum for middle school and high school for these really fundamental things, because we are teaching kids, not only are we not teaching them the right things, we're teaching them the wrong things. If you look on Netflix or Instagram or TikTok, there's a good chance if that's where you get your knowledge and education,
that's the difference. We didn't have that. And that's much more seductive than have your mother or father talk. First of all, you're right. There are 50% divorce in the country. Also, parents are much more busy. It's much more difficult. They're learning from screens, and the screens basically don't do that. I go back to people ask me,
not only don't they teach them the wrong things.
They're the wrong thing.
I'm sorry. Right.
I go back to my, you say I didn't have it. I did have it. I went to a Catholic school, and the nuns made it very clear, the golden rule or else.
That's true.
And they taught me with the golden ruler. If I didn't, and also they made it very clear that if I did the right things, I'd go to this really good place. If I did the wrong things, I'd go to this other place. Now, later on, I sort of questioned that, but that was inbred in me. The idea of being
exactly
good. The 10 Commandments. We repeated those things every morning almost.
So let's do this. What I'd like to do is I want you to spend 5 minutes telling people who have not read your first book, On the Road Less Traveled, about your life, just in a few minutes, because that will help explain why you have spent help explain why you've spent so much effort now in your life trying to help other people live more fulfilling, meaningful lives. As you probably heard at the beginning of this podcast is people who want to find meaning and purpose in their lives, right? You're the perfect guest, right? Because you've done this on your own, by and large. You've overcome a tremendous amount of obstacles and a lot of adversity, which I know has kind of helped you along the way. You consider a gift in many ways, but why don't you tell people really quickly about from the day you were born until you actually got, let's say, to the University of Rochester?
I was, I'm one of the most grateful people in the world. I mean, I'm grateful. One of my principles right now is being grateful. I mean, I try to think every day to do something good for somebody because I've lived the American dream. I started out, I was born too long ago, 1936, and on my birth certificate it says to an unemployed father and a homemaker mother. My father was an immigrant, came over in 1900, became very successful. He was involved in something called radio, was technology at the time. 2932, he lost everything, lost all. He had houses, even had an airplane and so forth. Lost everything, and his mother died, which he was very close to. And he's basically broke in 1933 and decided either to commit suicide or drive across country to California where the streets were paved with gold. On the way across country, he stopped at a cousin's house, fell in love with his 18-year-old, 15 years his junior woman. They went on to California. Streets weren't paved with gold. Dad had trouble. Dad had demons, plus he had trouble keeping a job. But I was born, and that was supposedly the good thing that happened. But 3 years after I was born, my mother decided she'd had it. This guy was very difficult to live with. He couldn't keep a job. And so she actually, in 1939, got a divorce, which was shocking. And she took me from Los Angeles, where we were living in St. Louis, where her parents were. And he got $5 a week in alimony and child support and Sunday visiting rights. So he gets in his roadster about 3 months later, does the 3-day trip, picks me up on Sunday, and instead of taking me to the movies or to a park, gets back on Highway 66, which is on the front of the book, and essentially kidnaps me. And subsequently, some short period afterward, said my mother died and I'll never see her again. And if you want to find out what happened, you have to read the book. Dad and I lived together for the next 2 years. He was a merchant marine radio operator. And so I didn't have any family. I lived with friends or neighbors, hotels, motels, and so forth. When the war broke out, he was supposedly drafted or volunteered to become an officer in the United States Merchant Marine, and I got put into the Catholic welfare system. And the next 5 years, I was in 5 Catholic welfare situations. The first of which was cold and abusive. Actually, it was almost Dickinsonian, and they sort of progressed. And finally, at the fifth one, they actually were nice people. It's only 6 months though, and I was finally having a good time. Actually, she tried to get me to play the piano. They were wonderful people. She really wanted to have another son, but the war ended. And my dad wanted me back, and so I got on an airplane alone and flew across country. And we lived in the YMCA on 34th Street for that summer, which was, there weren't many Harvard graduates there, as I remember. It was kind of a crazy place, but I learned the subways. And then the next, we went to Coney Island and lived in a hotel with him room, and while he looked for land-based work, and he couldn't find any. It wasn't bad year for me. I was PS 106. I did pretty well, but he had a really tough time, and then decided to go back to sea. And so he had found a neighbor lady to take me, and he decided he really had to leave in the month of July. And sure enough, neighbor lady said, no, didn't want me. All right, couldn't do it. And he said, I got to leave. So he contracted with the hotel manager and a local restaurant and left. And so I spent the most of that summer by myself. Traveling.
And how old are you?
11. 1947. I was 11 years old. And I always tell the joke about taking the subway. Was 5 cents to get to the Polo Grounds to watch the New York Giants play. I also went to museums and so forth. Come September, she was supposed to take me, and she wouldn't take me again. So he, from the ocean, he was able to get me into an orphanage in Far Rockaway, which was really a real break. I mean, it was really unbelievable break. So I arrived at this orphanage and integrated into, there were 100 kids there, half girls, half boys. And luckily they were attending a fine, public grammar school, which I flourished in. I mean, I really just flourished. The first time, it was a terrible thing, but it was the first time in my life that I actually had consistency and community at the same time. But there was a rites of passage. It wasn't such an easy place to work my way in. And I was a little guy. Until I was 14, entering high school. When I was in grammar school, I was like 4'5" and 65, 70 pounds. That's in the book. And so I was a little guy. It was hard, but I did very well at PS 104. And then things were going along great. I entered the high school there, but I aged out of this orphanage. They didn't keep people. By 14, my father completely disappeared, which was the fourth abandonment. By the way, I love my father, and he did what he could do. He had a tough life as well, but he had abandoned me completely. And luckily, the welfare system, I became a ward of the state, and they could have sent me any place, to a reform school or whatever else. Boys in those days were sent awful places. But I got sent to another orphanage in Yonkers, New York, which was 4 blocks from an outstanding public high school. And there I had an epiphany in my sophomore year. I decided I was going to go to a private college. Everybody laughed at that because, kids from orphanages, most of them didn't go to private colleges. They either worked or went to the local public institution. And I applied to the 3 scholarships that, that was offered at the time. And good Lord blessed me. I got the NROTC scholarship. And I could pick any one of 52 universities. I wanted to go to Cornell, but they wanted 5 years. I got accepted there. They wanted 5 years. And a place called the University of Rochester, which I never heard of, because I wanted either Cornell or RPI. And as my third, I got allowed to apply to 3 colleges, so that was my last one left. They said they would get me through in 4 years. So I put my black leather jacket on, and I got on the bus, and I went up there as a freshman. And the first week was rush week for fraternities, and I got turned down by every fraternity because I didn't have the clothes or the conversation or the haircut or anything like that. But, it was a great experience for me. And as I said, one of the things about my life is that these disadvantages I had became advantages because, as I said, when I got to university, it wasn't such a good deal, but the food was better and the room was better than the orphanage. So I figured I'd hang around for a while. And things turned out very well at the university. Sophomore year, I got pledged by all the fraternities. My senior year, I graduated as a chemical engineer, actually, and commissioned as an ensign in the United States Navy. And I was picked as out of 400, I was picked of one of the 12 seniors in the Senior Honorary Society. So I worked there very well. And, Rochester, as I say, I arrived in a leather jacket in 1954. And 50 years later, I gave them the largest gift in their history. And they were kind enough not only to name the engineering school after me, which is wonderful because now a bunch of kids have to learn how to pronounce my name correctly, which is important. They also gave me a statue. I don't know how many statues you have, Mark, but I'm the first one in my neighborhood to have an 8-foot bronze statue. So it's
Well, not only don't I have a statue, but I have been to your
oh,
statue
there you
on
have
more
it.
than one occasion. So I have stood in front of the Ed Hajim School. I have stood next to the Ed Hajim statue. And I have a child who has a degree from the Ed Hajim School of
Whoa,
Engineering.
whoa,
Yes.
that's exciting.
So I think I get a lot of Ed Hajim points. So now that people have an idea what you went through, which is quite unbelievable. Ed told the story like he was going to the candy store, right? But it's quite, when you think about all the places he lived, how many times he had to move, to be told that his mother was no longer alive, to be abandoned by his father 4 times. This is not something that most of us go through. And look at, and this is a audio only podcast, but if you saw Ed's face, you would say, this doesn't look like a guy who's had such a tough life. This looks like a guy who's very grateful and very happy and is spending his entire adult life trying to help as many people as he can, which is something you and I have in common, Ed. So let's get to the book number 2, The Island of the 4 Ps. And the protagonist, is it Marquitas? How do you pronounce it?
Marquitas.
Marquitas. Okay. So Marquitas, who's the protagonist, goes from one place to another. And it's a fable. I think it's fair to say it's a fable or an allegory.
No, I believe fables have communicated ideas to me personally as well as, and also a fable traps you into your own thinking. It traps you into thinking about yourself when you take a fable.
So talk about Marquitas and the fable of the Island of the 4 Ps and why you wrote it and why this is so important and why you created a curriculum out of it.
Well, see, I believe that there are only 2 constants, and one is your inner voice. That starts very early and ends when they take you away, and change. And I believe you need a vocabulary to handle that change, to make decisions. In other words, what you really want is to be able to pivot in life when necessary. And the only way you do that effectively, in my mind, is have a conversation with yourself. In fact, this should be written down as to where you're going and why you're going there. So when you come into that turn in the road, it's not the end of the road, it's just a turn in the road. You're moving in the next direction. And I felt a fable which would basically every person who in life can associate with Marquitas and with Thalia later on, because that's what you go through. You go through finding your passions. And passion's an overused word. I understand that. It's talents, it's interest, it's likes and dislikes, and it's context. Your passions in Kiev today are different than your passions in New York City. So, but everybody goes through that. So I'm trying to simplify it. It's kind of like the Chinese medicine cabinet. I want you to put your passions in there and pull it out every once in a while and say, how are they changing? I was a kid about this, but in high school it was math, science, baseball, basketball, and girls. That was my passions. And that when in college, that morphed. After my freshman year, I found that athletics were interesting, but I wasn't going to be a professional athlete. That morphed into extra activities. And one of my extra activities, I created a humor magazine my junior year, which was crazy. But it taught me my real passion was putting people together to solve a problem, to create a product. And once I did that, I had an even further passion, a deeper passion. I really enjoyed helping people do better than they thought they could. And I didn't realize that till 10 years later when some young man who was working for me when I was the CEO said, Mr. Hajim, it's really great working for you because you really want me to do better. And so I sort of learned that's when, and these are different kinds of passions. Of course, my passion today is giving back and gratitude, but these things change. And so now, so principles. Now, principles could be first. We argued that I wrote the book 2 ways. And one principles in my mind, early on, what rules are you going to follow? What lines won't you cross? Because life gets pretty fuzzy when you get out there in the real world. On Wall Street, almost every day you can make a mistake. Somebody will call you with information you shouldn't have. And you got to make sure you got lines you won't cross. And the principles evolve also over time. Now, there are fundamental principles like, do unto others and the 10 Commandments and so forth. But there are principles that go through life that change. Some have to be added. Some have to be. And I have things on my wall right now, principles I've kept, which says one of my principles in managing people was you can basically accomplish anything as long as you don't worry about who gets the credit. And that really helped me a lot. Then I took that to the next step. I started to purposely get a habit of deflecting credit. Ed, you've done a great job. No, it wasn't me. I was there, but Mary Sue and Jose. You get a trifecta of feeling when that happens. And if you start doing that, people recognize that you're not in there for yourself.
Let me interrupt you 1 second, because I think that is such a critical point and something that I got wrong for many years personally. Many years I got that wrong until one day the light went on. And first of all, I think what people will find when they do that is it's like an anvil is lifted off their shoulders. When you no longer have to worry about or think of taking credit and you actually focus on making other people share, you feel much better, which is one of the themes of this podcast, which is, if you really want to feel good in your life, go help somebody else. When times are tough, go help somebody else. So I think that idea, that principle, that particular principle, just that one is so valuable. And I didn't learn it till way too late. And I think, as you said, the earlier you learn it, the better you are.
Well,
Sorry to interrupt.
I didn't learn that right away either. Early on, I wanted the credit. First, I wanted to be paid because I was poor. I was first struggling for financial security. But somewhere mid-career, early 40s, I came to realize that I can even be a better manager if I take not only, I always felt that don't take the credit, but I have to be able to deflect the credit. And then there's a message you give to yourself. Nothing is ever accomplished alone. Nobody does anything with no help. It just doesn't happen. But now, maybe back 20, 50 years ago, people did that. Maybe a painter did. But today, everybody needs help. There's no, that takes me to my third P, which is partners. You're only as good as the people you surround yourself with. It's just a fact. And of course, P1 is the most important experience. If you can find a barber, you can find somebody who's interested, who wants to support you.
Barbara's your wife.
Barbara's my wife, 60 years. And, she suffered just terribly, but 60 years of connubial felicity. But somebody who will share your life, someone who will support you, who you can support. That's the key to it. But also, almost everything you do, you need partners today. I always say there's 3 kinds of partners. Partners who can do things you can't do. Partners who can do things better than you can do them. The third partner is interesting. Partners who do things that you do really well that you don't want to do. If you can surround yourself with that either 1 or 2 or 3 or a single person has all those characteristics, you'll end up doing things you do really well that you want to do, which is nirvana. And that's what life is all about. And of course, partners go down all the way down the line to, I always tell young people when I go to graduations, look to your left, look to your right, pick out somebody who's a friend for life, if you can pull that off. Somebody who's going to be interested in you. And then, of course, I always say in partners, get groups of people. I belong to YPO and I belong to investment groups and so forth, who for 40 years have been listening to my stuff. And they can really tell me when I'm right and when I'm wrong, or where I'm going in the wrong direction. So, but you see, each of these words, passions, partners, principles, are something that everybody go through. They go through it informally, and it kind of goes off in this direction, that direction. I want to put it in a box. And when I go back to life, I want to pull it out when I'm on the beach down in the Caribbean and say, has this changed? Do I need to do something about this? And then finally, plans collects all those things and makes you write down the kinds of conclusions you're at. And of course, what's interesting in the plans chapter, you go to some place where there's a matrix where you put all this stuff in, you find out that some of the things that you do conflict with other things. You got to make certain decisions. Anyway, so that's it. And then I put those into the 4 realms of life, which I kindly work on very hard. Recognize self, you spend a lot of time on when you're young because you think about yourself. Then work and family become this, and I don't believe in balance. I think you're always out of balance. I believe harmony is the word I want to use between those 4 parts. Work-life balance is bullshit because you're always focused on something. As soon as you focus on your work, you're neglecting, to some extent, yourself and your family and community. And sometimes during your life, when I went to work for Lehman Brothers, well, that was a tough job. I focused on that. And my family suffered a little bit, and my marriage suffered a little bit, and I didn't do as much in the community area. Now, today I'm focused on community. I'm not focused on work. It's not important anymore. But that's what you have to think about. And then you think about that harmony. Are you harmonious at this point in time? Are you doing something you have to do? And that's something I want to communicate. And you use the 4 Ps in each one of those. You can use the 4 Ps in finding your passions.
I agree with you about work-life balance. That term, I get the idea. Well, I don't want to neglect my family. I don't want to have too little fun or too little variety in my life. But the problem is that if you focus on that, I think you're right. You're never going to be really great at anything, right?
That's right.
So you got to be great at something for a period of life. Then you can switch and be great at something else. Yes, this is what I was saying before. We are teaching kids the wrong thing. Work-life balance, bad idea. Quiet quitting. You've heard of quiet quitting, right? Where these young people say, well, I'll do the least I can because I want to have that work-life balance. You're not going to, and the reason I tell people not to do that, I'm sure you're going to agree with this, is not because you're cheating your employer or there's no super rule in life that says you must do this or that. It's because you will have less fulfillment in your life if you do that. If you say, I want to be mediocre at everything and just kind of balance it out, you won't be as happy and I wouldn't even use happy, you won't as fulfilled. You won't have lived as meaningful life as you could. So I'm with you on that one. That's again, one of those things that we're teaching that young people are being taught incorrectly, and which is why I like what you're doing in the curriculum with using the 4 Ps, is to get people straightened out and say, no, just because you saw it on TikTok or Instagram, it's not right. Let me tell you, it won't work for you in the long run. You will not be fulfilled and happy as you can in your life if you follow these crazy ideas. And what you're doing is you're taking some very fundamental ideas that have been around for thousands of years and putting them together in a package that you can deliver to these people.
Yes.
I think it's fantastic. I would like to see this or some variation of this. We could talk about that at some point. Move down the food chain into middle school and high school, because maybe not exactly the same ideas. You can obviously soften them up, make them a little bit easier for younger people to absorb. But I do think your idea of teaching young people these very fundamental things about life, the earlier we get them, the better. So I applaud you for that. I think it's fantastic.
Brunswick School, which is a very sophisticated, private school, is now using it for their seniors right now, and they're very excited about it. And they basically, I was hoping they would have, use their own. They're using the book, page 26. Let's talk about it. It's very interesting. So, but you have to have a simple language, because if you get too complicated, then you can't go back to it. Now, this is one simple language, and I think you're right. Early on, again, when religion had control of things and there was more information that took it, when the families were there, you had this people started out with certain kinds of values, and it's really changed quite a bit. And screen time, what's happened today, and AI adds to it, but AI now, social media, and what I call the geopolitical reconfiguration. These 3 things are huge changes which these young people have to deal with. And, that's why I'm saying that getting those fundamental principles down so you can find your direction, then I think is very, very important as early on as possible. Plus the fact you do have more opportunities than you've ever had before. And I
agree with that.
Yeah.
I'll tell you something interesting. I just read a book called The Pursuit of Happiness. And probably most kids in high school don't even read the Declaration of Independence anymore. That's another thing we've fallen apart on, or we call civics
terrible,
or social studies. People don't do that. It's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. But had they read, they often will quote the Declaration of Independence that says, we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they interpret the pursuit of happiness as, I have the right to be happy and do what I want to do and have fun and blah, blah, blah. But that's not what the pursuit of happiness meant in the 18th century.
No, exactly.
And well before that. What the pursuit of happiness is based on goes back to the Stoics, goes back to the ancient Greeks and Roman. And the pursuit of happiness meant to live a virtuous life. That's what the pursuit of happiness was, to lead a virtuous life. Well, I'm pretty sure that there's hardly a high school or maybe even a college, but certainly a high school in this country that explains that your purpose in life is not to be happy, it's to lead a virtuous life. And this is what we have to get back to. And what you're doing in the 4 Ps is, I believe, helping people not only have a direction, but to lead a virtuous life. Because if you follow those Ps, you'll get there.
Well, this 4th realm of life, community, I make it very clear. If you don't give back, and by the way, give back gives the greatest satisfaction. That's what you put on the planet for.
Exactly.
That's what you put on the planet for, is to give back, in any way you can. I have funds, so I've done that. But on the other hand, just give back your time is very important. If you work in the library when you're 80 years old and help people out find the right book and so forth, that's fine.
If you help people in the library when you're 20 years old, no, that's the point. If you want to get,
some of the schools are starting to move in that direction. Yes. My grandson is required 80 hours of community service every year. Interesting.
For instance, one of the things we talk about on this podcast is that we have a mission. That mission is to evolve from selfish to selfless, from inward focused to outward focused. And the reason is, and I go through people are sickening of me hearing it. I'm glad they're hearing it from you this time, because at least they think, well, Mark's not the only guy who's trying to ram this down our throats. But you're right. If you want to have a very fulfilling, meaningful life, what you just said, giving back, helping others, focusing on others, that's the key. And what you're doing, I think, in your book, and certainly even in your first book, was to refocus people on this is what it's about: gratitude, giving back to other people. That's how it's not only the right thing to do, it's what's going to generate the most satisfaction and meaning in your life.
I'm selfish in doing the things I'm doing because it makes me feel good. I mean, when you give a scholarship, and I'm told scholarships have to change my life. And a young lady who's my poster child, she's 5 foot high. She was a optical engineering major. When she got her PhD, she stood up in front of 100 people and said, "Wasn't Mr. Hajim, I wouldn't be here." Well, come on, that pays for everything I've ever done for anybody. Although I'm getting back people reading my book saying, one woman said, "My daughter wasn't interested in college. She read your book. Now she's a freshman at Notre Dame." Well, that's pretty good. I like that.
As a physician for all those years, you've hit the nail on the head. Every day I got a chance to help people. And to me, that was the greatest joy. It still is the greatest joy. And I had the opportunity to figure that out relatively early on, that's where the joy in life comes from, is helping other people. When I hear doctors say, "Oh God, somebody called me over the weekend, they bothered me with something," I go, no, you got it wrong. That's an honor. That's an honor that they trust you with the most important thing in their life. You should be thrilled, and you should be thrilled to help them. And so you had to walk off the golf course for 10 minutes. I get it. But the benefit you're going to get from helping that person is way more than the shot you're likely to shank into the water anyway. So I hearing you talk about this to me is a gift to me today, because we talk about this stuff on this podcast all the time, but it's very important that people hear that, not to say that I would never try to tell people we had the market cornered on these issues, but it's always good to hear from somebody who's lived an incredible life like you have and has reached these conclusions during your life and recognize that, like you said, you get the most out of it. When that young girl who got a PhD told people that she wouldn't be able to, if it weren't for you, that joy you get, then you're on the right track. You've done some really good things in your life, Ed, and you have. It's a pleasure. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up now, but it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you again. You will be hearing from me probably 5 minutes after we hang up today. Okay. I can't thank you enough for doing this, for all the good work you are continuing to try and do to make this world, our country, certainly a better place. This is no small thing. I'm not just saying this because I want you to feel good because you're my guest on a podcast. I'm telling you from the bottom of my heart that what you're doing, that your effort to try and help people live a more fulfilling, meaningful life is so valuable. And you should, I personally applaud you for willing to take this time in your life to do that.
Your conversation encourages me to keep going.
Keep going, my friend. All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we will be in touch. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you next time.